My parents forced me to quit my part-time job, calling it shameful and embarrassing. Now, they can't afford my college tuition, and they're upset that I found another way to make it work. I'm a 17-year-old guy preparing to start college in a few months. Recently, my parents informed me that they hadn't saved any money for my education. I'd already known this, so I took steps to prepare for the financial burden on my own. To be clear, I had a job, one that didn't pay much, but it was enough to cover basic expenses like traveling to college. When I quit that job because of their demands, I pivoted to something else, and now I'm catching heat for it. Let me rewind a bit to give you the full picture. My parents weren't always in financial trouble. For most of my life, we were comfortable, even thriving. Both sets of my grandparents were family friends, and that's how my parents met. They grew up together, and it was always understood they'd marry one day. After tying the knot, they started a cafe business, with both families investing heavily to set it up. For years, it did well. Things were stable, and when I was born, they only seemed to get better. The cafe flourished. It became a neighborhood favorite, pulling in enough income to keep us well off. But when the pandemic struck, everything unraveled. They had to shut down for months, relying solely on savings to survive. Even when things reopened, the cafe never regained its former success. The past few years have been a struggle. My dad picked up a second job at a small marketing firm while managing the cafe part-time. My mom has been working tirelessly to revive the business, but it's been a tough road. This shift hit me hard. I grew up in a life where money was never a concern. Suddenly, we were counting every penny. It felt like being thrown into icy water. I had no idea how to navigate this new reality. Call me spoiled, but anyone who's experienced such a drastic change can understand. I knew I had to take control of my life because it was painfully clear that I couldn't depend on my parents anymore. It's not that I blamed them, I could see how much they were struggling. They were trying their best to keep us afloat, and I didn't want to add to their burden. I couldn't bring myself to ask for money, it would only make them feel worse. So, I made a plan to get a part-time job, but I kept it a secret. Why? Because my parents were too proud to admit we were struggling financially. Even as everyone in our community knew about our struggles, my parents worked hard to maintain appearances. They dressed up for family events, even renting a car after selling ours, just to keep up the facade. It was heartbreaking to watch, especially since I knew everyone else could see through it. Nobody confronted them out of respect or pity, but the tension was palpable. My grandparents were deeply worried and repeatedly offered financial help. But my parents always refused. They saw it as a matter of pride, a refusal to admit defeat. Once, early in the cafe's decline, I suggested they accept help, and they were furious. I learned my lesson and never brought it up again. Determined to contribute without causing friction, I got a part-time job at a bowling alley 2 years ago. It was far enough from home that no one would recognize me, and I used football practice as my cover story. Technically, I did stay for practice before heading to work. The pay wasn't great, but it gave me a sense of independence and accomplishment. After a few months, though, the bowling alley replaced me with a full-time employee. It wasn't personal, and my manager even gave me a glowing recommendation. That helped me land my next job, a cashier position at a nearby bookstore. This job was riskier since it was closer to home. The neighborhood bookstore where I worked wasn't exactly the most discreet place. It stood a little too close to the kind of people my family knew, a little too close to prying eyes. Every day I clocked in, I carried this gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach that someone familiar would walk in, recognize me, and blow my cover. And if that happened, my parents would know everything, and the fallout would be more than I could handle. But despite the risk, I couldn't quit. The stakes were too high. I needed money. Maybe not enough to completely fund my college tuition, but enough to chip in, enough to prove that I could stand on my own 2 feet. My parents couldn't cover it all, I knew that much. If I didn't start saving now, my only options would be to take out a crushing student loan or somehow scrape through college while juggling work later. Neither felt like a good choice. So, I stuck with it, month after month. A few of my close friends knew about my part-time gig, but I made them swear to keep it under wraps. And their parents? They had to promise not to let a word slip to mine. Lucky for me, they agreed. For nearly a year, I managed to keep my secret safe. But then came that fateful day. She walked in, my neighbor, the kind of person who thrives on gossip, someone who could spin the smallest detail into neighborhood scandal. She wasn't someone you'd expect to find in a bookstore, and the moment I saw her, I knew I was doomed. She didn't even have to say anything. Just the smug smile she threw my way said it all. She knew, and she wasn't about to keep it quiet. I braced myself for the inevitable. By the time I got home, the damage was done. My parents were waiting, furious, ready to unload their disappointment. The yelling went on for what felt like hours. To them, my secret job wasn't just about me, it was a betrayal of trust, a slight against our family's pride. We're a business family, they said. No son of ours should have to work like this, not while we're here to provide for you. But it wasn't just about me working. No, it was about appearances. They worried what others would think. Would people assume the cafe business was failing? Would they pity us? My parents had been struggling for years to keep their financial troubles under wraps, but now they feared this would let the truth spill out. I wanted to argue, to tell them that everyone probably already knew or suspected the truth. But I kept my mouth shut. They were already too upset. And then came the ultimatum. I had to quit the job. I tried reasoning with them, explaining that the job gave me a sense of control, a sliver of stability amidst the chaos. I wanted to be prepared for college, to avoid being a financial burden. But they wouldn't hear it. To them, my job was a source of shame, a stain on the family's reputation. So, I gave in. I quit. It was one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make. Walking away from that job felt like losing a lifeline. But I couldn't bear to see my parents more upset than they already were. Yet, deep down, I couldn't fully trust their promises. They said they'd have money set aside for me by the time I applied to college, but how could they? Nothing about their behavior suggested they were changing their approach. I knew college would be expensive. And I knew, without a degree, my chances of landing a good job in this economy were slim. If I had to take out a loan, I'd be drowning in debt for years. So, I made a choice. I decided to turn to my grandparents for help. I couldn't let my parents know. Their pride would never allow them to ask for assistance, but I wasn't bound by the same rules. I loved my grandparents, and I knew they'd be willing to support me. This wasn't about bailing out my parents, this was about my future. A month after quitting my job, I arranged to meet them at my maternal grandparents' house. I laid everything out, the struggles, my worries, my parents' unrealistic promises. I told them I couldn't go back to work without risking another fallout at home, but I couldn't just sit and wait either. They listened, and, to my relief, they offered to help. My grandparents were ready to step in, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. They even wished my parents would come to them for assistance, confident that a little financial boost could turn things around for our family business. But my parents' stubbornness was a wall even my grandparents couldn't break through. The business had always been a point of pride for my parents, a testament to their hard work and determination. But what they seemed to forget, or perhaps intentionally overlook, was that their initial success had been built on my grandparents' investment. That seed money had been the foundation, yet my parents clung to the narrative of being self-made. It baffled me. My grandparents never flaunted their generosity, they never sought credit or held it over anyone's head. To them, the term self-made for their kids was more a gesture of love than an accurate reflection of reality. Despite my confusion, I decided to approach my grandparents about my concerns. They reassured me without hesitation, promising to cover my college tuition when the time came. The relief washed over me like a cool breeze on a stifling day. With that reassurance, I carried on for months without a trace of anxiety, blissfully living my life while the weight of future financial burdens seemed to lift. During this time, my parents remained uncharacteristically quiet about college expenses. I avoided the topic altogether, unwilling to spark their disapproval by mentioning my grandparents' promise. They, on the other hand, seemed to sidestep the issue as well, likely knowing they wouldn't be able to contribute. It was an unspoken truce until the acceptance letter arrived. The moment I read the email confirming my acceptance into my dream college, excitement surged through me. But with that joy came the inevitability of facing reality. That evening, over dinner, my parents sat with expressions that betrayed their unease. After some uncomfortable small talk, they finally opened up. They admitted they had been struggling financially and hadn't managed to save enough for my tuition. Their solution? A student loan or working through college, anything that wouldn't require asking for help or, worse, exposing their struggles to others. As they spoke, their voices tinged with embarrassment and resignation. I couldn't bring myself to feel angry. I had anticipated this moment. When they finished, I simply smiled and told them not to worry, I had it covered. Their stunned expressions revealed they hadn't expected such a calm response. But then came the inevitable questions. How? Why wasn't I panicking? My calm shattered as I confessed the truth. I told them I had already spoken to my grandparents, who had offered to help. Their reaction was immediate and explosive. Accusations flew, claims that I had betrayed their trust, ruined their reputation, and acted sneakily behind their backs. They demanded I apologize to my grandparents and retract my request, concocting some excuse about a misunderstanding regarding my college fund. I stared at them in disbelief. Minutes earlier, they had admitted they couldn't help me, yet now they expected me to reject the one lifeline I had? I stood my ground, explaining that I saw no shame in accepting help from family, especially when it was offered freely and with love. I also planned to repay my grandparents once I started earning, making this a temporary arrangement rather than a handout. But they refused to see reason. Their pride blinded them, and they delivered an ultimatum. If I accepted the money, they would cut me off entirely. The days since that argument have been agonizing. My parents refused to acknowledge me, treating me as if I don't exist. The silent treatment stings more than their angry words ever could. I'm left grappling with a heart-wrenching decision: honor my parents' impossible demands or accept my grandparents' support and risk losing the relationship with my mom and dad entirely. The weight of their disapproval feels unbearable, yet I know deep down that their accusations aren't fair. What's worse, the emotional toll of their indifference has left me questioning everything. Am I truly in the wrong for seeking a path to my future when they couldn't provide one? Am I the villain in this story for not aligning with their flawed sense of pride? Update: I can't thank everyone enough for the overwhelming support and advice. The outpouring of kindness has been unexpected and deeply moving. Many of you believe my parents are being unreasonable, and I'm beginning to see the truth in that. Some comments have even called me a doormat for continuing to love and live with them after everything they've put me through. But here's the thing, I'm still a minor, and despite their flaws, I love my parents. They've given me so much over the years, and walking away isn't something I can easily imagine. That said, I know what they're asking of me now is wrong. Their refusal to compromise and their insistence on pride over practicality is hurtful, but abandoning them in their moment of struggle feels equally wrong. For now, I'm still caught in the middle, unable to find a resolution that feels right for everyone. At just 17 years old, I faced an unexpected wave of hate for a decision that felt not just reasonable but necessary. I wanted to be with my parents, to address the cracks in our relationship, and to find a way forward together. Yet, when the fractures couldn't be mended, I stood firm. I told them I wouldn't back down, no matter how uncomfortable the truth was. My grandparents were offering to pay for my college education, and I saw no valid reason to decline their kindness. I respected my parents' perspectives, but I couldn't let their pride or sense of reputation dictate my future. Loans weren't an option, nor was sacrificing my education. So, I laid it all out, delivering a heartfelt speech in the living room while my parents sat in stony silence, pretending not to hear. But I didn't care about their lack of reaction. I needed to say my piece. The ball was now in their court. They could either accept my decision or continue clinging to their misplaced pride. Either way, I was resolute. My future was mine to shape. 2 weeks later, things began to shift. After my declaration, I moved in with my maternal grandparents. It wasn't an impulsive choice, but rather a necessity born from escalating tensions at home. About 3 or 4 days after I announced my plans, my mother finally broke her silence. Late one night, she came into my room, her face etched with anguish, and collapsed into tears. For the first time, she opened up about the struggles my parents had been facing. The cafe, once a symbol of their independence, had become a financial albatross. My dad, she revealed, was too proud to accept help. His refusal to rely on anyone, even during dire times, had left them stuck. As I listened, I saw her pain, her vulnerability, and I couldn't help but hug her. She assured me she would support me, but her words were tinged with sadness. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of a fierce argument. My parents were shouting at each other downstairs, their voices raw with anger and hurt. My father, brandishing a wad of cash, accused my mother of betrayal. She had sold her jewelry, pieces she had cherished for years, to help fund my college education. To him, it was a step too far, a blow to their dignity. But she defended her choice, arguing that the family's well-being mattered more than appearances. I stood frozen, watching the storm unfold. My father's anger eventually gave way to grief, and I heard him sobbing alone in his room. It shattered me. He had always seemed unshakable, a figure of strength. Now, hearing him cry, I felt a pang of guilt mixed with compassion. My mother was no better, crying silently in the living room. I couldn't bear to see them like this. That's when I made the call to my grandparents. Their arrival marked a turning point. An intervention was long overdue, and as a family, we laid everything bare. For now, my parents are living with my dad's parents while I stay with my mom's. We've started meeting on weekends, slowly rebuilding the bridges that had burned. It's not perfect, but it's progress, a step toward healing. Now, fast forward a week into college. The relief is indescribable. My grandparents have fully embraced their role as my benefactors, and my parents, after much turmoil, have come to terms with the arrangement. They've moved back in together and are trying couples counseling, which, from what I hear, is going well. Even more encouraging, they finally accepted help from their parents to reinvest in the cafe. They're brainstorming ways to reinvent the business, to breathe new life into it. I hope their efforts bear fruit, not just for their sake, but for mine too. The cafe has become more than a business to me, it's a piece of my heart. Looking back, I understand my father's reluctance to let it go. It wasn't just about pride, it was about preserving a legacy. Now, as I stand at the threshold of a new chapter in my life, I want to embrace every moment. The struggles I've faced have taught me to value the present. Life is unpredictable and fleeting, and I refuse to let fear of the future rob me of the joy of living. The road ahead is uncertain, but for the first time, I feel a sense of hope. My family is healing, my education is on track, and I'm determined to make the most of this opportunity. The worries will come and go, but for now, I'm choosing to live fully, boldly, and without regret.